we're a huge global outlier on guns. And with guns, sometimes we're hamstrung by federal policy and federal laws, as we've seen. But we're committed here in the legislature to do everything that we can to move the needle. So I think we will see a number of bills. There's a number of things that I'm involved with that are going to come forward this year that we think can move the needle. But in a lot of areas, we're tweaking, right? We have good gun safety laws. How can we tweak them to make them better? We have good safe storage laws. How can we tweak them to make them better? We have red flag laws that we kind of help pioneer. How do we make sure that information gets out about them to all the sheriffs and all the local counties that have to deploy and enforce these laws?
Hello and welcome again to another episode of Sacktown Talks. I'm your host, Jarrett Blondie, and today we're joined by Senator Josh Becker. Josh, thanks for joining us. How's it going?
It's good. Thanks to be here. Thanks for having me. Sorry.
I know. It's good to finally have you in. I know you were when were you first elected? In 2021, is that it?
Yeah, I started in 2021. Yeah, like the 2020.
Yeah, it's kind of funny during COVID. You know, not a lot of us hasn't been getting to go around and see people, so it's fun to kind of talk to the new members and kind of get a little background and know a little bit about them. A little slow there today. So Josh, I guess for our listeners who don't know, can you tell us about your background and how you decided to get into politics?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I had a lot of different experiences, both in the public sector, private sector, nonprofit sector, and really starting out with working in politics on the East Coast. After going down to Central America, getting inspired to get involved, I got involved with some campaigns, worked on Capitol Hill, was a press secretary, and until the Democrats lost the House, the Senate. We lost, the member I was working for lost, and that was really the time I came out to California. And right before I came out, I got involved with starting an early internet company, and that really led me to focus on technology for 10 to 20 years around clean tech and later in biotech. But I had a nonprofit for 20 years called Full Circle Fund. And Full Circle Fund, what we tried to do was look holistically at issues like education, climate, affordable housing, a lot of the same things I'm working on today, but look strategically across the Bay Area and figure out, how to do grant making. And in that process, I started thinking more and more about the incredible opportunity it was to set policy for the state of California and the opportunity to leverage the incredible platform that could exist if you could make it up to Sacramento. And that's when I started thinking more about running.
Interesting. So I guess where were you born and where'd you grow up?
I was born in New York, but really Philadelphia is where I grew up, suburban Philadelphia.
And then where'd you go to school?
I went to Williams College, a liberal arts school in Western Massachusetts, very small liberal arts school, and then came out to Stanford for law school and business school. Okay,
and then after law school, you went back to DC, and that's when you started working in politics?
No, that was all pre-Stanford.
Okay, interesting. So what you said you worked in Congress. What member did you work for?
I worked for one named Marjorie Margolis-Mezvinsky, and I volunteered on her campaign. I was an intern. She ended up winning. She was running to be the first Democrat in 116 years from the Philadelphia suburbs where I grew up. And she ended up winning a very upstart race. And her press secretary was our press person on the campaign, which was Jake Tapper. You may see he's the CNN political commentator. Right. And so when Jake left, I took over.
Interesting. And so what was this like in the mid 90s? Is that?
Yeah, early 90s.
Early 90s. Yeah. And then when did she lose and when did you come out west?
She lost in 94, kind of the Gingrich takeover of the government, Contract on America for your listeners who remember back that far. But that was really when I think, DC started to get much more polarized and much more unhealthy, really started with Gingrich and that election of 94. But yeah, we lost our seat and Democrats lost the House and Senate. And it was time for me to leave DC.
So, you're on the East Coast, your whole life at that point. Kind of what brought you out west and, thought to come out to California?
Well, I was always going to go to law school. My dad was a law school professor, and I was very focused on law school. And I was applying really to law public policy programs and got into several of those. But at Stanford, they didn't really have a classic government program. But a friend of mine said, well, you can get a certificate in public management at the business school. And I said, well, that sounds interesting. And so I applied to that and ultimately was deciding between law, public policy, or law business. And I decided that I'd been on the Hill at that point
Right.
for a while, and I'd sort of seen a bit how the sausage was made. So I thought policy school would be really interesting, but I thought I'd seen the inside of it a little bit. And business school, I thought I would not like. I thought it'd be like medicine. I think like I'm not going to like it, but it'd be good for me just to get that experience, and I could get also that certificate in public management. And so that was ultimately the decision. That was really the reason I came out here to California for that program.
How was law school? Being that your dad was a law school professor,
Yeah.
Was it already implanted in you? Was it easier, or could you call dad for help?
No, I don't think so. No, it doesn't quite work that way. But Jenny, it was great being out in Silicon Valley for 4 years. During that time, by that point, I'd been invited. When Marjorie lost, as I mentioned, we started an early internet company, so that kind of got me kind of deeper in the ecosystem.
Like right. So what year did you graduate and you started getting the internet? That's like right when everything started blowing up, right?
Yeah.
Tech-wise?
Yeah. Well, we started our company in 94, and then I graduated in 99, and that was right at the peak of the first .com wave.
Crazy. And so kind of what was it like back then? I remember like everyone, kind of like everyone talks about this tech bubble. That one was even a little more out there, huh, for the time?
Yeah. I mean, it's exciting. There's a lot of real innovation. There's also a lot of things that, probably shouldn't have been funded and ultimately crashed.
Right.
But when the whole thing came crashing down, it was like, nuclear winter. I mean, it was just, there really wasn't much going on at all in the tech world. And so then I left and I went to an enterprise software company for 4 years called Agile Software. So I got to have that experience, which was interesting. So I got really to spend more time on the company side and learn that part of the business. Mm-hmm. So it was interesting, but things were really shut down.
Right. Kind of, that you kind of worked in Guatemala during the 90s, kind of like, what was that experience like? And kind of how is that, I guess being in a third world country and seeing how other people live, how's that kind of shaped kind of how you look at things up here and things that we can do better, as legislators?
Yeah. I was out last night with our Woman of the Year. I picked jointly with Assemblyman Belinda Arriaga, who runs ALAS, which is an organization that supports farm workers in the San Mateo coast. People don't realize that, but we've got thousands of farm workers there, and kind of a spotlight got shined on after the kill. We had the shooting there.
Oh yeah.
If you remember a couple months ago. Anyway, it's an incredible organization. Please look it up. But in that, I ended up telling this whole story, and they didn't know. They're like, "How do you not tell me this story? How do you not know?" So I could tell the long version of the short version, but essentially went down to Guatemala to do human rights accompaniment work. This is where people would accompany U.S. People from the U.S. would accompany human rights figures so they didn't get blown up, essentially, which was happening in the early 90s. And so we were there to accompany refugees on the return from southern Mexico, San Cristobal de las Casas, crossing the border back to Guatemala. And so we were in those refugee camps there. When that return got postponed, we went over to El Salvador, where they just signed a peace treaty and worked in a community of repatriated refugees. So these were people where the women and children had fled to Honduras during the brutal civil war there. And had come back and reestablished a community called Copapayo. Our community is called El Sitio, but there had been a massacre in their previous community, and they'd reestablished this community called El Sitio. And we're there to support, originally it was building cinder block houses, and we were trying to create a very basic daycare center for the women who had to work in the fields and build houses. So it was a really intense experience. So there was no school in the community. There'd been some supplies donated. So we ended up buying books and started teaching basic literacy and math and establishing a basic school there. So what was really incredible was just getting to know the people really well in our community, which was about 350 people. And seeing that fundamentally everyone's the same,
right,
and has the same hopes and dreams and problems and issues, and just it was a really unique experience that just really couldn't replicate. So it does probably create my interest in farm workers and immigrant communities for sure. But I think in general approaches, a lot of the issues that I work on and kind of the social justice orientation.
Right.
Yeah.
I guess before you were elected, you spent a lot of time in venture capital, but kind of venture capital on the good side, right? Investing in clean tech and companies that go out and do good. Can you kind of tell us a little bit about that experience and kind of some of the work you did?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of ways to have impact, and I'm really enjoying this role. But I'd worked, as I mentioned, with a nonprofit called Full Circle Fund that we funded other nonprofits for 20 years. And then also started an early impact investing fund where we invested in things that only had a social mission. So the extended green economy was one. The other one was the other theme was inner city and ethnic entrepreneurs. And we started doing this, kind of 15 years ago. And I'd say people are focusing on it now, but we were kind of leaders maybe there early on. And it was interesting. It was sort of the early days of clean tech. But, a lot of the innovations there now are kind of bearing fruit, right? So the price of solar has come down 90% over 10 years, 300% over 30 years. And a lot of it's those different companies working at different parts of the, of solar, right? Just tweaking each little part to make everything cheaper.
Right.
And so it just gave me great familiarity. We really focus on sort of the extended green economy. So not big manufacturers, but things like, energy efficiency and helping people. There's a company called O-Power, which is really comparing people via the energy bill and turning that into a marketing document for energy efficiency that ended up being really successful. So it was really fascinating. And we started Clean Tech for Obama. We really rallied nationally the kind of green energy and clean business community for Obama. And that was informative for me too, because after he won in 2008, there was some good things that happened for sure, but I also saw how difficult it was at the federal level to set clean energy policy. And so that's, again, where I started really focusing more on California as a lever. We said, hey, this is the fourth at the time, maybe sixth largest economy in the world if it was a country. If we can really move the needle here, we can help lead the country and lead the nation.
Yeah. And I think that's something that's cool. Someone with your background up here in the Capitol, making law, making decisions on budget issues and things like that. Kind of, having your background and what kind of what are you excited and kind of what do we need to, specifically look at kind of in this kind of green area to kind of make the steps, make the goals that we really want to make?
Yeah. Well, it's really about every area of the economy. I mean, that's what's exciting about it. And so my team, we look at it holistically. We know we've got 420 million metric tons of CO2. We got to get to zero. So it's a very tangible, metrics-driven situation. We're reducing at 1% a year. We need to be reducing about 5% a year. Right. So we know we need to move a lot faster. So my very first year had bills on a number of things, including cement. And if you read Bill Gates' book, he always says, what about cement? Because cement and concrete themselves are 8% of world carbon emissions. And in my very first year, we got a bill for net zero cement. And it was actually the only segment of the California economy that had a net zero target at the time. So, just look at where you can have impact. Transportation's with 50%. So we've worked there. Buildings, I have a number of big bills on buildings this year and passed a bill my first year on electric ready homes. That's about 15%. We have the grid, which is about 15% of our emissions, and bills on transmission and interconnection and kind of wonky stuff regarding the grid. And then agriculture. Agriculture is 8%. So I have a bill on cow burps and what they call enteric fermentation, which is critical part of emissions. So you have to really, that's what's exciting about it, and also the challenge. It's literally every area of the economy. And but I'm really excited this year for my bills on buildings and also looking at carbon removal, right? Even our most ambitious scenarios, we have to remove 65 million metric tons of CO2 every year in 2045. And right now, we're doing very little of that. So I have a bill to set a long-term predictable market for carbon removal. So there's just a lot to do, and that's what's really exciting about it.
Yeah. I guess for our listeners who don't know, like what are the ways to remove carbon and kind of what are we currently doing on that?
Yeah. Well, both nature-based solutions, but what we're seeing is, again, entrepreneurs innovating. So things like direct air capture. These are literally just machines that capture CO2. This is not point source emissions like carbon capture and sequestration. This is just removing carbon from the atmosphere and finding ways to bury it. And right now it works. It's just very expensive. And so the question is, can you create a predictable market so you bring down the cost over time?
Right.
But we've seen entrepreneurs invest in other ways. I mean, there's folks who are sequestering CO2 in carbon, using in cement, actually using that process kind of in reverse to sequester carbon. So there's lots of innovative ideas, and that's what we want to try to stimulate that. Yeah.
It's pretty cool because, you work in venture capital, and here you are, you're chairman of a budget subcommittee, kind of dealing on kind of climate and the environment and things like that. Kind of, what are some of your budget goals this year in that committee?
A lot. I mean, we'll have our hearing this week on, on really the climate package, and the goal again is to move as fast as possible, and we have to do that by, especially in a tough budget environment, by getting the most bang for our buck. And so that's what I'm very focused on: is what are those solutions that are getting us the biggest bang for the buck, both in terms of removing carbon from the atmosphere, as well as our environmental justice goals, right? Making sure that we do this in a way that kind of empowers traditionally disadvantaged communities. We're not going to reach our goals of electric vehicles if we don't have infrastructure in poor communities, right? If there's not appropriate incentive for folks there to buy electric vehicles. So it's really, again, it's a great challenge and a great opportunity. And what's terrific with the subcommittees, we get to look at each piece of that. The other big things are wildfires and making sure that we're using new technologies to fight wildfires and that our aerial resources are appropriate, along with just funding the men and women who are on the front lines themselves of fighting these fires. So we've made a big move over the last few years to focus on prevention, and I'm really excited about that. We're fortunate to have a good fire year, meaning a less bad fire year last year, and but hopefully this year too. But we still got a lot of work to do.
Yeah. Kind of, what is your kind of position on housing and affordability and homelessness, and kind of how do you plan to promote more equitable access to housing in your district and kind of across California?
Yeah. Well, we need a lot more affordable housing, and unfortunately, our affordable housing finance in the state is quite Byzantine, and so I'd like to see over time that we simplify that. But in the meantime, as far regards to homelessness, we got to invest in solutions at scale. How can we get lots of people off the streets very quickly? Right. And you'll be announcing a bill on Thursday. I don't want to scoop it too much right here, but let's just say we're finding some really innovative models out there that are working to do this, and we want to really just kind of juice those up and speed them up that much more by taking advantage of excess public land, by making it easier on private land, and making sure that these can be both high quality but also fast and inexpensive. And I think that's what we're going to do with this bill. It's super exciting.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Since COVID, the world is the change, especially Northern California, where everyone used to, live and work, in your district. Yeah. And now people have just moved all over the country or, all over the world. And now it seems to kind of maybe changing back where, businesses are trying to kind of require employees to move. And, there used to be a great talk about sustainability, live, work, everything close, sustainable. And it's kind of we've lost that vision or forgot about it. Kind of what are some of your thoughts about this? It's kind of the world's change and kind of maybe things might be going back, and kind of how do we kind of get back to where we were to kind of make some progress?
Well, a couple of things. One is, I'd like to see we should be diversifying jobs across the state. And so that's where I think we have a big opportunity with these federal laws, with the infrastructure law, with the Inflation Reduction Act. We've not been successful yet in attracting some of those really big government grants and loans to build, say, big battery manufacturing plants. And we should be focusing on building those in the Central Valley, in the Inland Empire, building whole economies there. As you know, maybe I spent 15 years on the board of UC Merced. Why UC Merced was I thought, okay, number one, this was a chance to build something from scratch. We knew ultimately it was going to have tens of thousands of students. Right. And to be part of that kind of founding group and thinking about the stories that would be told for years with those founding students was just really exciting. But it also, anytime you build a world-class university, eventually you grow an economy around it. And so the opportunity to add jobs and add economic vitality to that area was super exciting to me. And we've definitely seen that already so far, but I think we could use now as the time with all this federal money to, again, bring some of these factories to areas like Merced, and again, spread jobs more throughout the state. So that's something I'm really excited about.
No, definitely. That used to be the backbone of the Central Valley manufacturing. So that'd be great to see that come back. Definitely. You had a tragic event this year in Half Moon Bay, the shooting, big shock for everyone in Northern California. Kind of, what's been going on in the community, and kind of what are some of the things you guys are working on to make sure that doesn't happen again?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned that earlier. It was just a huge shock, and in many ways, we're still recovering from it. And when I was with Belinda, one of my staff members was actually over in Oaxaca. She went from the White House. She was invited by NSU to Oaxaca to the funeral of one of our farm workers that was killed here. And because he was undocumented for 24 years, even though he built a house in Oaxaca, he couldn't go home. Wow. The only way he could go home was after being killed.
Wow.
And so it was obviously very emotional for everyone, and they were just recounting that story last night, so it's on my mind. But gun violence is it's obviously one of the plagues of this country. We're sort of a global outlier in a few areas in terms of our system of for-profit health insurance that makes us have pay so much for healthcare without getting great returns for it. The way a lack of funding for things like childcare, and the amount of people we imprison, and then finally guns. We're a huge global outlier on guns, and a lot of things in California, again, in climate. That's why I get so excited. Is we can lead the country, we can lead the world. With guns, sometimes we're hamstrung by federal policy and federal laws, as we've seen. So, but we're committed here in the legislature to do everything that we can to move the needle. So I think we will see a number of bills. There's a number of things that I'm involved with that are going to come forward this year that we think, can move the needle. But in a lot of areas we're tweaking, right? We have good gun safety laws. How can we tweak them to make them better? We have good safe storage laws. How can we tweak them to make them better? We have red flag laws that we kind of help pioneer. How do we make sure that information gets out about them to all the sheriffs and all the local counties that have to deploy and enforce these laws? So there are some, big ideas we're still working on, but a lot of it's sort of tweaking what we already have. I mean, despite the 2 shootings, California has many fewer gun deaths per capita than other red states that have looser gun laws. Those are just the facts. Right. But that's not of solace to someone right after shooting like that.
Yeah,
so.
Totally.
For a lot of us, and me for sure, it's been, okay, how do we go back to the drawing board and do everything that we can?
Yeah. It's interesting. You just kind of briefly mentioned kind of healthcare. Can you kind of talk about your advocacy kind of for healthcare and kind of where you see, I guess, California should be in terms of, affordability and access? Yeah,
listen, we've done a lot of great things in terms of increasing access here in California, including to undocumented folks in certain age groups. But we're still ultimately fighting, a system, as I mentioned, we're again a global outlier, and we're the only country that has this kind of system. There's really 3 main systems in the world, and we have kind of a little bit of each one, right? We've got the VA, which is kind of like the British system, where the insurance is public and the doctors are public. We've got our Medicare system, which is kind of like Canada's system, and then we've got this, great other, sort of system sort of for everyone else, right? Where we've got the health insurance system, and I think just too much money is kind of sucked up by health insurance, unfortunately. And I would like to see us move to a single payer or multi-payer model over time. In the meantime, we're just still trying to make sure that people have as much access as possible. That we certainly keep the incentives for doctors to want to come here and practice. We increase the number of doctors. Say in the Central Valley, for example, we have a huge shortage, right? So we're trying to build a medical school at Merced, and the governor's actually been very supportive of that, which is super exciting. So there's a lot we can do in the meantime, but fundamentally, I'd like to see us join the rest of the world and have a different process.
And I guess, something, the third outlier you mentioned is kind of our criminal justice system, right?
Yeah.
Kind of what are you looking at in criminal justice reform? I know Gavin Newsom was just out at San Quentin.
Yeah.
And a big announcement out there, but kind of what do you think, we need to work on?
Well, it's super exciting. I mean, as with climate, our team is trying to take a very holistic approach, looking at everything from how people end up in prison and what they call the school to prison pipeline.
Right.
Number 2 is sentencing. California has 3 times as many people serving life sentences as Texas. even though we're only 25% bigger, but we have 3 times as many people serving life sentences. In terms of a percentage of people in our prison system serving life sentences, we have 30% serving life sentences. Missouri is next up at about 10%. So that sort of tells you that we may have that we certainly still have an over-incarceration problem, right? Now, we may have an under-incarceration problem at the front end too. We have to have accountability, and I hear that people want to have accountability for property crimes and other things that we are seeing a rise, even if it's a very slight rise. But the fact is, with our sentencing policy, we've been sentencing people far too long as well. So that's a second area. Third area is just treatment in prison, because we want people to reenter society. And I'm really proud that I passed the free prison phone call bill that was called Keep Families Connected. And I just heard this story last night. Someone was up in Pelican Bay, and this guy came up to them and said he literally met his daughter for the first time.
Right.
Because he didn't have to make a collect call. He could call, and he met his daughter for the first time. And we get letters all the time from people now benefiting on that. And this year I have a bill around canteen, so the egregious markups to very basic things like toothpaste that people pay for in prison. These are all things that inhibit, make it harder for people then to reenter society successfully. And so that whole area of reentry, treatments, and then really goes in the fourth area of reentry, right? How are we setting people up for success? I had a bill about restoring voting rights for people coming out of prison, which is one piece of it. But really, how we think about treating people both in prison and sort of that first year before you exit, so that they're prepared for successful reentry. With Full Circle Fund, the nonprofit I mentioned, we had funded something called Defy Ventures, and we basically do business plan training and entrepreneurship training in the prisons. Yeah. So I participated. We had the first ever business plan competition in a state prison pre-COVID, and it was incredible. So those are really the 4 things we're working on, and I think certainly we're having an impact, and the state's policy is having an impact too.
That's so interesting. That was something I wanted to ask you. Is like with all the work you've done with Full Circle, and kind of you get kind of like this little budget, right? And like what ideas have you got from Full Circle that you could bring here to the state and kind of do on a larger scale? Yeah,
I'd say a lot of things that we've talked about in terms of scaling clean energy, and for example, there's a nonprofit called Grid Alternatives, which is saying, hey, great, how can we do job training, take people, train them basically to put solar on the rooftops of low-income homes, and also, lower people's bills, right? So kind of all that sort of same time, right? How can we think about making that sort of a win-win? Right. And that's informed some of the work I've done around equitable, we call it building decarbonization, equitable building decarbonization. So, that's an area for sure. In childcare, we actually did more my first year than I would have hoped we could do in a decade. We still have a long way to go, but establishing a universal TK. Right. That was so huge. We went from no preschool to now every kid in California is going to have at least 1 year. Some will have 2 years of preschool. Now there's things we have to do around mixed delivery and other things to make sure that works optimally. But there's a number of things we'd worked on, and we'd worked on a statewide ballot initiative on childcare that didn't pass way back when. And so to see, childcare and early learning. So to see early learning policy advance has been huge for me. Those are a couple areas. I think about an area that we worked a lot on, which is like teacher retention. Right? We spent, we kind of get teachers in, but about 40% of teachers were leaving. And COVID, we've seen this as well. So it's kind of interesting thinking back to my Full Circle days and like, okay, what can we do around teacher retention and also teacher recruitment, which we have to do now as well. So thinking back to some of the things we did with Full Circle.
That's fascinating. This winter we've been just hit by storm, and especially in your district. I saw what the San Mateo Bridge fell one day. Kind of how the storm's been impacting your district, and kind of what's been going on.
Yeah, I have a vast amount of the coast, and so that's really where we've seen some of the worst issues. Highway 92. If you've ever been out to Half Moon Bay, he's like. I was telling them, hey, there's a sinkhole forming here. Like right next, after the storm, massive sinkhole. But Caltrans really reacted, put a lot of people on there and restored access. But now we have Highway 84 in my district, where it's just was dramatically affected in the last storm. And flooding. So we actually built one of the things, the good things we did, San Mateo County, thanks to Congresswoman Eshoo and others, we built some really terrific farm worker housing called Moonridge. But that was flooding. And so we had to make changes. And my local supervisor, Ray Mule, and others have done that now so that we didn't have a flooding in this last big storm. So mobile home parks, particularly, we've seen some bad flooding there. I've been to a number of them that have experienced that. And we're trying to figure out how to prevent that next time. So we've seen, some significant flooding and then some really significant effect on our roadways as well.
No, definitely. You're just seeing the potholes form. I remember driving in the rain and just seeing this big chunk of like cement come towards me. And I was like, oh, that's how a pothole is formed, right?
Really?
It's pretty crazy out there. So hopefully we're using your clean cement to fix this all in the summer.
Going forward, yes.
Just before we get you out of here, because I know you got to go, major news event kind of in your area, Silicon Valley Bank, and the aftermath there. And you were instrumental, of following it on Twitter, saying, I've been talking to regulators. Can you kind of talk about your involvement, kind of, helping solve that for, I guess a lot of people in your district would have been affected.
Yeah, I was hearing from a lot of people for sure. But our role here was really to push the feds. I mean, ultimately, it was a federal issue. I should say Gavin Newsom, the governor, was extremely responsive and was talking directly to the president. Senator Padilla was extremely responsive and giving me regular updates. So I felt like our job was sort of help convey the seriousness of it and make sure people knew really this was fundamentally about people making payroll.
Right.
You just had so many companies that had all their money tied up. And we knew that ultimately they were going to get it, but if they got it 3 months from now, that wasn't going to be helpful, right? They'd have to lay off everyone on Monday. I mean, you're under California law. If you can't pay someone, you're not supposed to keep employing them. And so that was really the huge issue, right? We had all this all this money just tied up, and companies on Monday would not be able to make payroll.
Right.
And so it was a pretty hairy weekend, and was really excited when we got the resolution. And we had someone come to our caucus today. We've had a long conversation around it and took a look at the causes and the effects and kind of going forward. But certainly we staved off the worst effects of that, right? Which would have just been all these companies not being able to make payroll. But we're still seeing some of the effects on some of the regional banks. And those regional banks are important, both for companies, for construction loans, for other things. And we have to figure that out going forward, the health of those banks. But thank God we, the feds came through and we were able to free up that money. Otherwise, would have been really disastrous.
No, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story. Very interesting stuff, and looking forward to the work you're going to do this coming year.
Thanks.
And for your big announcement on Thursday. So.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, Josh.